I am a Vietnam War veteran. Before I tell this story, I hope you will put yourself in my position at that time. War is something terrible. On the battlefield, there is no right or wrong. There is no good or bad, only kill or be killed. It was around 1972 when the Vietnam War was entering its final stage. We got a mission to rescue a sergeant after receiving his distress signal. We were near the battlefield with Vietnamese troops, and my unit had lost a lot of men. Our rescue team was pulled together from many different units. Because it was urgent, we only had about 15 minutes at midnight to get our orders, grab our weapons, and head out. We didn't even have time to get to know each other. We traveled through a swamp in a small boat. The night was pitch black, and the sounds of the jungle were eerie and unsettling. The water was murky, and the boat rocked gently, making us all feel uneasy. As we paddled, I kept thinking about the mission. We didn't know what we would face, and that scared me. Near morning, we approached a village. Our plan was to bypass this village and enter the forest ahead. Through that forest, we would reach our destination, where the distress signal was coming from. It was about 5 a.m. As soon as we got ashore, we took out our cameras to snap a few photos together. Just as we finished taking photos and put the cameras away, we came across a Vietnamese family. A father, a mother, and 2 children. In war, when discovered, you have to either destroy them or abort the mission. So there was no other way. We used knives to quickly finish off the family, including the 2 children, and we buried the bodies quickly before heading into the forest. My hands shook as I dug the graves, the reality of what we had done sinking in. We had to move on, but the images of their faces stayed with me. As noon approached, we were suddenly attacked. Bullets fired from somewhere, and we quickly crouched down, figuring out where the gunshots were coming from. We concentrated our fire there, and after a series of rounds, the gunfire stopped. It seemed like the target was destroyed. We went to check the place where the gunfire came from and discovered a few dead bodies. The terrible thing was that these bodies were not fresh. They seemed to have been dead for a long time. One of them smelled rotten. There was a girl who had been shot in the stomach but wasn't dead yet. We finished her off and moved on. When we arrived at the place where the signal was sent, it was already dark. We saw a house that looked like a small abandoned school. We quickly approached and determined that the school was empty. There was no one. We decided to sleep there, lighting candles small enough so that the light couldn't be seen from outside. We took turns keeping watch. In the middle of the night, while I was on guard, there was a noise outside, accompanied by a cold wind that blew out a few candles. I quickly alerted the others to prepare for an attack. When the candles went out, we couldn't see anything at all. We gathered in a circle and took roll call. 1, 2, 3, to 10. We had 10 people there. We waited in silence for a long time, but nothing happened. We assigned guards and went back to sleep. Towards morning, the watchman's screams were heard. We ran out to see a horrifying scene. One of us was killed and hung on a tree right at the entrance, his intestines ripped out. From the name tag, I knew this person's name was Mark. I called the command center to report Mark's death, but the commander scolded me. He said Mark was the sergeant we were supposed to rescue. I was speechless, not understanding what was going on. Why was the person we were looking for in our group? The commander said he would send a helicopter to pick us up right away because we had to move somewhere else and the mission was canceled. A while later, the helicopter came to pick us up. After returning to the camp, our group immediately dispersed. After the war ended, I was unable to reconnect with anyone who participated in that mission. Even my commander died. I guess most of the people who joined me that day died because we were in the center of the battles and were constantly attacked. Later, I printed out the photos taken that day. There were 3 photos in total. In the first 2 photos, we had 9 people, but for some reason, in the 3rd photo, there was 1 more person. Years have passed, and the memories of that mission still haunt me. Mark, the sergeant we were supposed to save, had been with us all along, yet he had been dead the whole time. Who then was the extra person in the last photo? My name is Jack, and this story goes back to 2007 when I had just moved out due to some arguments with my mom. I needed a place close to work and found myself renting a small cabin nestled in a wooded area on the outskirts of an urban center, which was perfect because it was near my workplace. I'm a coder, and the short commute was a blessing. I had been living in this cabin for about 2 months when this unsettling incident happened. It was a lightly rainy night, which added a chill and an eerie silence around the cabin. My routine after coming home from work usually involved some quick dinner and then unwinding with some TV until I fell asleep. On this particular night, everything was normal until I heard a voice from below my loft bedroom that startled me out of my relaxation. The voice asked, "Who's up there?" My heart raced as I muted the TV. It sounded like it came from inside the cabin, but part of me hoped it was just noise from outside. Peering out of the small window, the darkness compounded by the misty rain made it impossible to see anything. Cautiously, I called out, "Who's there?" But only silence greeted me back. With a mix of fear and caution, I approached the hatch door of my bedroom. Thinking it could be someone I knew, I even called out, thinking absurdly that it might be my mom checking in on me, but there was no response. Deciding to investigate, I opened the hatch and descended the stairs. The living room was quiet and dimly lit by the soft glow of the street lamps filtering through the rain. I switched on the light and glanced around. Initially, I saw nothing amiss except for some muddy footprints that I oddly assumed were mine. After making sure there was no one on the first floor, I turned off the light and headed back upstairs, still a bit unnerved but trying to shake off the feeling. I settled back in front of the TV, trying to focus on the show, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Then, just a few minutes later, there was a loud pounding on the bedroom door from below. This time the knocks were forceful, clearly meant to intimidate. Now there was no denying someone was inside the house. Despite the terror that gripped me, I forced myself to stay calm. Knowing there was no lock on the door, the vulnerability of my situation was starkly apparent. After waiting in tense silence for what felt like ages, I gathered the courage to check if my phone was by the bed. It wasn't. I realized it must be downstairs. With the pounding having stopped, I opened the hatch door once again and peered down. The flickering light from the TV cast long shadows, but I ventured down, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. Reaching the bottom, instead of turning on the lights, I decided to slip out the back door. Barefoot and heart pounding, I ran to the nearest neighbor's house where I could see lights. I knocked desperately, looking for help. When someone looked out the window next to the door, I explained my situation through the glass. But the neighbor just stared back, unsettlingly silent, not responding at all. The lack of reaction made me even more anxious, and I quickly retreated. I hurried back to the cabin, locking everything behind me, and turned on every light. As I looked around downstairs for my phone, I finally found it in my jacket pocket, where I had absent-mindedly left it earlier. Relieved, but still on edge, I went back upstairs to grab my phone charger. To my horror, this time it wasn't an empty room that greeted me, but a woman sitting on my bed, staring blankly at the TV. She slowly turned to look at me as I entered, and in that moment, my fear peaked. I didn't wait to see what she wanted. I sprinted downstairs, ran out of the house, and called 911 from a safe distance. I watched from my car as the cabin remained eerily quiet under the drizzle. When the police arrived, they searched the property and confirmed the woman had left, likely into the woods. The officer advised me to stay elsewhere for the night, so I ended up going back to my mom's house despite our recent arguments. The next day, I returned to gather my belongings and decided it was best to leave the cabin for good. The landlord partially refunded my rent after I explained what happened. He seemed oddly uncurious about the details, which added to my unease about the whole ordeal. Between the creepy neighbor's reaction, the strange woman in my cabin, and the landlord's quick acceptance of my departure, the whole situation felt interconnected in a sinister way, or perhaps it was just a series of unfortunate coincidences. Either way, it was a chapter of my life I was eager to close. My name is Luke, and I'm not the adventurous type. Most of my time is spent buried in books or tackling assignments, so when my best friend, Sierra, suggested a camping trip, I was hesitant. We've known each other since childhood, growing up in rural towns where hiking and fishing were regular pastimes. Despite this, the idea of spending a few days in the wilderness wasn't exactly thrilling to me. However, Sierra's enthusiasm is contagious, and I found myself agreeing to her plans more often than not. She had been suggesting the camping trip for weeks, and I had repeatedly dodged her with excuses. By the time break rolled around, I was out of excuses, and she had already planned everything with me in mind. So, on Sunday, we set off. Despite Sierra dragging me out of bed before dawn to hit the road, I found myself in an oddly good mood. I had spent the previous day either eating or napping, enjoying the most uninterrupted rest I'd had since Christmas. We drove out of Mojave, her old Jeep bathed in the early morning light. We talked about classes and tests, then about the camping spot she had found in the Inyo National Forest. It wasn't an official campground, she explained, but a dispersed camping area. This meant we registered a permit with the Park Service and could pitch our tent anywhere we liked, with no amenities such as water, heat, or electricity. Leave it to Sierra to take things to the extreme. As the desert scenery gave way to the greens and browns of the forest foothills, I rifled through our packs. I trusted Sierra's planning, but wanted to ensure we had everything, especially since we were going off the grid more than I anticipated. We each had our own tents and sleeping bags, along with a few days' supply of food and water. Cooking utensils, first aid kits, and other essentials were divided between our two packs, which were piled high. I recognized landmarks near the Mammoth Lakes, but Sierra took us farther north, and I lost track of the terrain. She turned onto a trail that led deeper into the mountains and parked at the end of a dirt road at the foot of a hill. I was out here last week looking for spots, she said, opening the door. If we hike around this hill, there's a little valley with a lake at the bottom where we can set up. I groaned as I strapped on my pack. How long of a hike? I asked, wincing at the sound of pots clanging together. Next time I'm packing my own bag. Maybe half an hour. A little cardio never hurt anyone, I guessed, and I adjusted my pack before tightening the hip strap to keep the weight off my shoulders. Sierra was right. Just around the hill, the terrain dropped dramatically towards a lake at the center of a valley, almost like a caldera. Sierra led the way down, through steep ground where I worried I might slip and roll all the way to the lake, but the firm dirt made good footing, and the trees provided good handholds. Sierra suddenly stopped, and I heard the rush of water. I peeked over her shoulder and saw a stream, almost a small river, cutting across our path. The melting snow from the mountains had swollen it, and the log that served as a makeshift bridge was already submerged. Only a few more minutes of walking after we crossed this, Sierra said, nudging the log with her boot. It seemed sturdy enough despite being underwater. I'd be careful, I said, leaning over the stream. There were tiny ripples on the surface, but it looked deceptively calm. Sierra laughed and stepped onto the log. Yeah, that's why I don't plan on swimming in it. She shimmied across, and after a few moments, I followed. It wasn't a long crossing, maybe 20 feet, and we were making good progress. But it's always the little things that get you. Halfway across, Sierra's foot slipped, and she leaned forward to regain her balance. Her sleeping bag, tied to the top of her pack, broke loose from its strap, tipping her forward. That little shift in momentum was enough. Sierra tottered for a split second before falling. I was right, the current was swift. She reached for the log but was already too far downstream by the time she resurfaced. I scrambled across, hoping to reach the other side before she was swept away. Luck was on our side. The stream was fast, but not deep, and it couldn't pull her under. Some 20 yards downstream, her pack caught on a fallen tree, and that's where I found her, gasping and sputtering. Maybe it was a combination of adrenaline and the ice-cold water, but by the time we stumbled to our campsite, Sierra was laughing hysterically. She had twisted her ankle in the stream and was limping ahead while I carried her pack along with mine. I don't plan on swimming in it, Sierra giggled, and then I fell right into the damn thing. I couldn't help but smile despite lugging around 60 pounds of gear. Now I had a story to tell when I got back home. By noon, we had pitched our tents and hung our wet clothes to dry. Sierra dug a fire pit to cook our lunch since we had neglected to bring a stove. I took a moment to survey our surroundings and was pleasantly surprised by the beauty of our campsite. We were by the lake's edge, where the mountains flattened out and the tree line ended a few yards from the shore. After spending nearly a year in school dorms, the quiet was almost uncanny, broken only by the wind in the trees and the gentle lapping of waves. It was alluring, like a lullaby. Sierra cursed beside me. She was struggling to get the fire going, her hands shaking as she struck another match. A small pile of used matches lay by her knee. "Let me try," I said, sitting up. She almost got swept away by the stream an hour ago. Sometimes, the shock hits after the adrenaline wears off. I had more luck, and once the fire was going, the rest of the afternoon and evening passed pleasantly. I rummaged through my pack and found that Sierra had packed marshmallows and chocolate for s'mores. I tossed the packaging on the ground and jokingly said, "I see my pack was heavy because it was full of these essential supplies." Sierra grinned and shrugged innocently before unceremoniously shoving marshmallows into her mouth. "Aren't those for cooking?" I asked, and Sierra gave me a mock look of confusion. I laughed. When the sun set, we agreed to retire early to wake up at sunrise and explore the area. I slipped into my tent and zipped it closed, checking my watch one last time before the sound of waves lulled me to sleep. I woke up in the dark, and something felt wrong. The air was heavy, and my skin clammy, as if I had just broken a fever. Nothing inside my tent was disturbed, and the outside was silent. There was no rational explanation for the feeling, but it was undeniable. A tapping on my tent flap broke the silence, followed by a whisper. "You need to come outside," Sierra said, her voice trembling. I took a few deep breaths and clutched my pocket knife, unzipping the flap in a flurry of motion. Sierra stood there, her hair disheveled and eyes wide with fear. She clamped a hand over my mouth, motioning for silence. For a few moments, we only heard our heavy breathing. Then Sierra's gaze drifted towards the lake, her pupils dilating until her eyes were almost black. "Run," she whispered. Without questioning, I leaped up and followed her into the woods. We crashed through the undergrowth, and it felt strangely easy. Perhaps because Sierra was clearing the way, or maybe because I was simply terrified. "Sierra," I called, but she didn't answer, only the sound of her breathing and the snapping branches. "Sierra, what's going on?" Still nothing. Then the adrenaline began to wear off, and I stopped. It was too dark to see. We had left all our lanterns at camp, and the canopy blocked any moonlight. We'd been running for minutes, but there were no cuts on me or branches snagging my hair. It was like the trees were welcoming me. Ahead, Sierra had stopped too, standing still, her breathing inaudible. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Not until you tell me what's going on." I called back. Sierra shook her head. It was darker where she stood, but a clearing behind her silhouetted her against the trees. "We're almost out of the forest," she said, and she was right. The forest couldn't end here, though. It took us half an hour to hike in, and that was downhill. I felt like a fish chasing a baited hook. Sierra turned and took an impossibly long step towards me, closing the distance in an instant. I ran. I turned and sprinted as if the devil himself were after me. If the trees had welcomed me before, they now turned hostile. Branches clawed at my clothes and skin, roots tripped me, but I kept running. Behind me, I heard her pursuit, but it sounded wrong, like something with four legs. I didn't look back, focused only on the light marking the end of the tree line. I burst onto the beach, falling hard onto my hands and knees. My wrist crunched with the impact, but I kept crawling until I was almost in the water. When I turned around, nothing was there. I wasn't far from our tents and watched as Sierra's tent unzipped from the inside and she stepped out. "What are you doing?" she asked groggily. I ran to her, nearly knocking her over with a hug, my legs giving out. "There's something in the forest," I said. Sierra immediately grew serious. "Did you see someone?" she asked, scanning the dark tree line. "No, well, yes, but I don't know," I admitted, hesitant to speak of it. "Something tried to lure me into the forest, but I don't think it's human." Sierra stared at me, and I feared she'd call me insane, but she didn't. "We need to get to the jeep," she said. "No," I replied, regaining composure. "It wants us in the forest." "We're practically in the forest now," Sierra reasoned. The Jeep is right there. We need to leave. I looked up, seeing the Jeep's glint in the moonlight at the hill's top. It seemed so close. We could outrun it again, but no. The Jeep was over a mile away, behind a hill. We shouldn't be able to see it from here. Whatever it was a good hunter, and good hunters come at night, quietly, disguised as everything you want. In the dark, they're a light. When trapped, they're escape. When lonely, they're company. I pushed Sierra away. "Why didn't you wake up when I ran into the forest?" I asked. She shrugged, looking at me like I was being an idiot. "You were quiet," she replied. "But you heard me when I came back. You were louder," she said. A tense silence followed before Sierra threw her hands up in frustration. "What use is this? We need to leave," she shouted. "No," I said, stepping back. "I'm staying here." She looked at me like I was insane, but I stood my ground. Sierra took a step towards me, and I flipped my pocket knife open, pointing it at her. She stopped, unsurprised. "So, it's like this, huh?" I nodded, and we lapsed into silence. Sierra talked all night. First, she begged me to leave, emphasizing the truck's proximity and the danger we were in. As the night wore on, she spoke of stranger things. She asked if I was tired, and I didn't reply. "You never have to be tired again," she said. "I don't just mean tonight. What will you do once you leave? Go back to your life? Work? You'll be tired for the rest of your life, and you'll die tired," she said, gesturing towards the trees. "You can stay here forever. I promise you'll never be tired again." When I didn't respond, she spoke of her sisters, though I knew Sierra had no sisters. She talked about how they would gather berries for me and make a crown of oak leaves. They stitched clothes with no seams and made fabrics from sea foam. I was entranced. She painted pictures of how they'd make me flutes and harps, and we'd dance through the forest in winter, leaving only footprints in the snow. "When you sing," she said, smiling, "the snow will melt, and you'll bring the first flowers of spring." Still, I didn't move or sleep. Just before dawn, Sierra stood. "So this is it. A marvelous hunt comes to an end." Her voice no longer sounded like Sierra's. She bowed mockingly before turning and walking into the woods. "You may leave." She laughed over her shoulder, melting into the shadows. Her laugh echoed, rippling the water and shaking the trees. I didn't trust her. I waited until the sun was high before grabbing only my knife and running. I encountered nothing in the forest but didn't stop to look. By the time I reached the Jeep, my legs burned and my heart pounded. I didn't touch the brake pedal driving out of the mountains, nor did I look back. But as I passed, the trees cast shadows on the ground, and just before I reached the foothills, I swore I saw one shaped like a woman, waving. I called park services in the nearest town, giving a sanitized version of events. They searched the area and found Sierra's body face down in the lake, carried there by the current. I don't know what I pulled out of that stream, but it wasn't her. It sounds twisted, but I was relieved to hear the news. I had thought that maybe Sierra had never been there with me, that something else had planned this trip from the start. I'm still in shock, but I'll mourn my friend in time. I saw the stream. It was shallow. Sierra shouldn't have died, but it killed her and would have killed me. As beautiful as its words were, I did not stay. It has no power outside the forest. When you see it, you'll know. My name is Maya Carter, and I've been a professional psychic for nearly a decade. People seek me out for various reasons. Closure, guidance, sometimes just a sense of connection to something beyond this world. My clients range from the hopeful to the desperate, and my ability to connect with spirits has always been a source of both wonder and burden. Lately, it's been more of a burden than ever. I've been seeing Mr. Thompson for 2 months. He'd come in every day if I let him, but it takes a lot out of me. Too much. He creeps me out. I want to stop seeing him, but the money he pays is substantial. Times are tough. Here's how it works. We sit at the table in my room, and he gives me an article from a loved one that he wants to communicate with. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Spirits can't be coaxed into returning to this life and using a psychic as a vessel. It's more like a trap I have to set. Once I have a hold of them, they can use my eyes and my voice, but nothing else. I won't allow that. I have a timer. 4 minutes is all they get. Any longer, and I start to fade into them as they fade more into me, and then madness ensues. I'm not present for the conversations. I'm in a dark corner of my mind until the timer goes off. My body is trained to wake my mind. Mr. Thompson is in his 80s, hunched over and pushing an oxygen tank. He always brings a small square of fabric, taken from the clothing of his lost loved ones, and a small envelope. Since he's been coming in, strange things have been happening to me. Bouts of sickness, bruises that appear out of nowhere, and I hear things. Dark things. Last time it seemed like he tried to tamper with my timer while I was under. I shouldn't see him anymore, but like I said, times are tough. I've set up a camera this time, mounted discreetly on the ceiling and pointing down at the table. I need to know who he's talking to beyond the 9 names he's already given me. I think he's been lying to me, using me to try and bring something terrible into our world. He hands me a flannel square and says the name, Daniel. I hold it and close my eyes. I find the spirit that feels right and grab hold of it. I hit the timer. The next 4 minutes are black. The alarm goes off. Mr. Thompson has tears in his eyes when I wake up. I feel sick. He thanks me and pays me. See you next week. After he's gone, I look at the footage. On camera, my body shakes. The spirit takes over. I open my eyes and sharply inhale. My voice is a young man's, a whimpering whisper. Oh my God. Mr. Thompson's voice is giddy. He opens his envelope and spreads photos on the table. Polaroids, dozens of mutilated young men. Do you still feel the pain from when I drilled holes into your skull and injected hydrochloric acid into your brain? He asks. Please, leave me alone. Never. Do you remember when I cut off and ate parts of your body? I watch in horror as the conversation continues. Do you remember when I cut off your penis and ate it in front of you? He taunts another spirit. Even in the afterlife, you boys belong to me. The young man's voice, filled with terror, responds, Please, no more. Mr. Thompson leans in closer, his voice a sinister whisper. I'm going to be spending a lot more time with all of you. I turn off the footage and vomit. I've been helping an old killer reconnect with his victims. I'm going to reach out to the police. I'm praying they believe my story. I hope they're here next week when Mr. Thompson comes back. Hello, I'm Jack. Let me tell you about a night that changed the way I see my home forever. I'm 20 years old and I live in a big fancy villa with my mom and younger brother. My English name is Jack, but I'm actually Chinese. My parents divorced when my brother and I were young, so it's just the 3 of us. My mom is 50 years old, tall, and has a strong presence like a person from a Western country. She is very successful and works at a financial company. My mom decided to take a 5-day trip with her friends and took my 10-year-old brother along. I was left alone at home, which I didn't mind because I'm old enough to handle it. The first 2 nights were normal. I watched movies and talked to my mom on the phone every day. But on the 3rd night, a big storm rolled in with heavy rain and lightning. I was watching a horror movie in my room on the 2nd floor when I heard my mom's voice calling me from downstairs. She said, Jack, come down here. I felt a bit surprised because my mom was supposed to be on her trip now. But no matter what, plans can change, especially for a busy person like my mom. When I was about to stand up to go down to the 1st floor, my phone rang. It was a video call from my brother. He was at a party with my mom, and he showed me mom dancing and having fun. My heart raced. If my mom was at the party, who was calling me from downstairs? I slowly walked to the top of the stairs, trying to see if anyone was down there. The house was dark and silent, except for the storm outside. Then I heard the voice again. Jack, come down here with me. It sounded just like my mom, but something about it felt wrong. The voice was calm and soothing, but it gave me the creeps. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. The voice called again, this time more urgent. Jack, I miss you so much. Come down now. My hands were shaking and I could barely move. I peeked down the stairs, but it was too dark to see anything. The voice grew louder and more desperate. Jack! Jack! Your mom knows you're up there. Then a burst of crazy laughter echoed through the house. The voice changed, becoming darker and more sinister. Jack, if you don't come down, I will come get you. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out. The voice continued, now angry and mocking. Jack, I'm already inside the house. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my phone and called our family driver, who lived just a few houses away. He answered quickly and said he would be right over. I stayed at the top of the stairs, listening to the voice that now seemed to be moving around the first floor, taunting me. "Jack, don't make me come up there." Within minutes, the driver arrived and used his key to get into the house. As soon as he turned on the lights, the voice stopped. The house was quiet again, but I was still terrified. Together, we went through each room on the first floor, looking for any sign of an intruder. The living room was untouched, with the TV still paused on my horror movie. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning through the window. The dining room, with its large wooden table and chairs, was eerily silent. Each room we checked was empty, and there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. The driver stayed with me that night. I didn't sleep at all, too scared that the voice would come back. The next day, my mom and brother came home early. I told them everything that happened, and we checked the security cameras. There was nothing on the footage, no sign of anyone else in the house, and no strange sounds. Thinking about the history of our land gave me the chills. Our villa was built on old farmland, and many of these fields were burial grounds. When the city expanded, the government took over these fields and sold them to private companies to build villas. So our house is on land that has a spooky past. It's common in my country, but knowing this doesn't make it any less scary. Since that night, I've never felt completely comfortable being alone in the house. Sometimes when it's quiet, I think I can hear whispers or faint voices. I wonder if the spirits of those buried here are still around, disturbed by the changes to their resting place. Every time there's a storm, I can't help but remember that night and the eerie voice calling my name. It's a memory that will haunt me forever. Hi, my name is Liam. I grew up in a small town in Vermont where there wasn't much to do except stare at trees and fields. If you liked being alone, it was the perfect place. As soon as I got a car and saved enough money, I moved away. I'm not against nature, but I'd choose the hustle and bustle of the city any day. My parents sold our old property 6 years ago. It was a 1-acre place with a big house and a shed out back. I was 14 when this happened, and my parents often left me alone because they trusted me. I was responsible and took care of the property. My family was always close-knit. My dad, a retired police officer, taught me how to handle firearms responsibly. He believed in being prepared for emergencies, so he made sure I knew how to use the pistol safely. My mom worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She was the heart of our family, always making sure everyone was taken care of. I also have an older sister, Emily, who had already moved out for college by the time this incident happened. We were a typical family with strong values and a deep sense of responsibility. One weekend, I was playing a video game on my laptop in the living room when I heard a loud, metallic bang from outside. I immediately paused the game and ran to every window to see what had happened. When I looked out at the shed, I saw its door wide open. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my dad's pistol from the safe. My dad had taught me how to use it responsibly just in case of emergencies. I went outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I shouted, "Who's there?" but got no response. When I reached the shed, I announced I had a gun before looking inside. The shed was packed with gardening tools, old furniture, and other random items. Someone could have been hiding behind any of it. Even though I wasn't easily scared, I felt really uneasy. I shut the shed door and went back inside the house. I locked the door and watched the shed from the window, expecting the door to open again. It was a heavy door, not something that could open by itself. Someone had definitely been there, but I didn't know if they were still inside. I decided to call my mom for advice. I went to the kitchen to use the landline and called her cell phone. She didn't pick up, so I left a voicemail. This was back when texting wasn't common. After that, I went back to watching the shed, with the TV on in the background to break the monotony. I kept the phone with me. I was about to give up when I heard creaking from upstairs. My heart pounded. Was I imagining things, or was someone really there? I felt like I had to protect my family's home, even if I didn't love it. I grabbed the gun again and went upstairs. I didn't call out, not wanting to alert anyone. At the top of the stairs, I turned on the hallway light. There were 4 doors, all closed. 3 led to bedrooms and 1 to the bathroom. The creak had come from my parents' bedroom. I got down on my knees and peeked under the door. I saw 2 bare feet facing away from the door. My stomach knotted up. This was real, and I wasn't ready to confront someone. I quickly went back downstairs and hid in the bathroom to call my mom again. She still didn't pick up. I left another voicemail, then called again and again. No answer. Finally, I called 911, whispering to the operator about what was happening. She told me to stay quiet and stay put. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, then stopping outside the bathroom door. A deep voice said, "Hey kid." I still remember that voice clearly. I almost cried from fear. Ignoring the operator's advice, I yelled, "I'm on the phone with the cops and I have a gun." I put the phone on speaker so the operator could hear. The man tried to open the door, but it was locked. I heard him walk away, then a door slam. I think it was the back door. I finally breathed a sigh of relief and waited for the police. When they arrived, I felt immense relief. After they checked the house and confirmed the intruder was gone, they asked if I had somewhere else to stay. I said yes, my uncle's house. We called my uncle, who came and talked to the police, then took me to his place. The part that haunts me is that it was my fault. I left the door unlocked when I went to check the shed. That's when the man must have entered. Even with a gun, I didn't feel safe. It was the scariest experience of my life. My name is Jason. I have a younger brother named Ben. The event happened on a weekend night when I was 13 years old. Our parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me in charge of my 8-year-old brother. It was a big responsibility, especially since we lived in a quiet, somewhat isolated house on the outskirts of town. We'd had a fun day together, playing video games and watching movies. As night fell, I put Ben to bed and then settled into the living room to read. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. My heart started to race. Who could be visiting this late? I got up and went to Ben's room. He was awake, looking as scared as I felt. "Jason, who's at the door?" he whispered. "I don't know, Ben." "Stay here," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. I crept to the front door and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing on our porch, his face hidden in shadows. He knocked again, more insistently this time. "Open up, I need help," he called out, his voice sounding desperate and a bit off. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone. I called Mom, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. "Mom, there's a man at the door. He's asking to come in. What should I do?" Mom's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Don't call the police, Jason. It's probably just a neighbor who got lost or someone who needs help. Just tell him to go away." I was skeptical, but I trusted my mom. I walked back to the door and called out, "Sorry, we can't help you. Please leave." For a moment, there was silence. Then the man started banging on the door, harder and harder. The sound echoed through the house, and Ben came running to my side, his eyes wide with fear. "Jason, he's trying to get in!" Ben cried. My heart was pounding, and I knew we couldn't just wait and hope he went away. The man's banging grew louder, and he started shouting, "I know you're in there! Open the door!" I grabbed Ben's hand, and we ran to my room at the back of the house. The man moved to the windows, peering inside and knocking on them as he went. "Let me in! I need to talk to you," he yelled. We heard him jiggling the doorknob at the back door, trying to open it. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and held it tightly. "Stay behind me, Ben," I whispered. The man began to pound on the back door, and we could see the door shaking. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Ignoring Mom's advice, I dialed 911 and explained the situation in a trembling voice. The operator assured me that officers were on their way. The next few minutes felt like hours. The man continued to pound on the door and windows, shouting and trying to scare us. "I'll find a way in," he screamed. Ben and I huddled together, hoping the police would arrive before he broke in. Finally, we heard sirens in the distance, and then the red and blue lights of a police car lit up our front yard. The banging stopped abruptly, and I heard the sound of a scuffle outside. The police had arrived just in time. The officers arrested the man and took him away. One of them stayed to talk to us, making sure we were okay. When they finally left, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Ben and I were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things could have ended very differently. The next day, we learned from the police that the man was a patient who had escaped from a nearby mental hospital. He had a history of violent behavior and delusions. Our house had once belonged to his ex-girlfriend, and in his disturbed mind, he believed she still lived there. If we hadn't called 911, who knows what might have happened. That night changed me. It made me realize the importance of trusting my instincts and taking action when something feels wrong. And most of all, it made me grateful for the quick response of the police, who undoubtedly saved our lives. If you ever find yourself in a situation like that, don't hesitate. Call for help. You never know how dangerous a stranger at your door might be. My name is James. For nearly half a century, I've held on to a secret so dark and strange that I thought it would die with me, but life has a way of forcing your hand. As I face the end, I find that some stories refuse to stay buried. I won't bore you with a long story about my time in Vietnam. It was terrible. It was terrible for everyone involved. But for me, it was especially bad because I was only 5'3". If you don't know what being short during the Vietnam War meant, let me explain. You arrive in country, and a senior officer points at you and says, "You'd be a good fit for the tunnel commandos. Want to join?" Technically, it's a question. Service in those platoons was voluntary, but it sure didn't feel like one. So that was my burden for the war, to be a tunnel rat, climbing down into deep, dark, dangerous tunnels filled with people and animals who wanted to kill me. Usually, we operated in the huge Cu Chi tunnel complex near Saigon, but not on that day. On that day, we were ordered to investigate a tunnel complex way up north, west of Da Nang. 2 of us were sent into the tunnel, myself and Mike. Now usually, black guys managed to avoid becoming tunnel rats because they were so tall. But Mike was burdened with the double misfortune of being short and black during the Vietnam War, a curse I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I was first into the hole, and Mike followed. We both had our small guns, some explosives, our wits, and not much else. If you're wondering why we carried the small guns, go fire a big gun in a narrow tunnel and come back to me. The last guy who tried that got sent home with blood pouring out of his ears. We crawled for what felt like an eternity. The tunnel was a tight fit, which meant it was probably freshly dug. It also stank something awful, which usually meant either spoiled food or some poor enemy soldier died down there and was left to rot. After about 40 minutes of crawling in total silence, I saw the tunnel ahead open into a room. I tapped Mike on the head with my foot, and I heard him ready his gun. I climbed down into the open chamber, pointing my gun at the shadows. The room was dimly lit by a small oil lamp, and it was deserted. We took a moment to adjust. It was the longest single tunnel segment either of us had ever crawled through. It also had no traps, which was unusual. Where was everyone who dug the damn thing? Save for the lamp hanging from the roof and a canvas tarp on the opposite wall, the room was empty. I approached the tarp and used my gun to move it aside. Behind the tarp was a stone staircase leading down. "A stone staircase this far underground?" I whispered to Mike. "VC didn't build this. This is old, very old." "Older than America old," Mike whispered back, fear evident in his voice. "We've come this far. We have to keep going," I replied. We both walked slowly down the narrow staircase. Our flashlights had red lenses, and I swear the illuminated staircase looked like we were descending into hell. The staircase was almost as deep as the tunnel was long. Finally, I saw the staircase blocked by another tarp, with light coming from the other side. I moved aside the tarp with my gun, my finger trembling on the trigger. My eyes lit up, my heart raced. I almost pulled the trigger, but I didn't. Something made me pause. The room had at least 10 people in it, none of them armed. I pointed my gun at the group and illuminated them with my flashlight. They didn't respond. They just stood there, rocking gently forward and back. "Mike, don't shoot. There are people in here, but there's something wrong with them." I stepped into the tiny room, which was lit only by small candles. Mike followed. We both shone our flashlights at the people. They paid no attention and continued to rock gently forward and back. I shone my flashlight in one of their faces and clicked my fingers. She didn't respond. Her clothes told me she was VC. They were all VC, 3 women and 7 men, all gently rocking forward and back, not a care in the world. Their eyes were a solid color, which I couldn't quite identify because of the red light from my flashlight. Mike motioned with his flashlight to the corner. Their rifles sat in a pile, badly rusted. Jesus Christ, Mike, how long have these poor souls been down here? I don't think Jesus Christ frequents this place, came Mike's terrified response in his thick accent. I shone my light to the front of the room. The VC were all facing a small altar. I walked toward it. On the simple stone plinth stood a gold statue illuminated by several candles. The statue was ornately crafted. It was of a beautiful naked woman, the top half anyway. The bottom half was something like an octopus, with dozens of tiny gold tentacles meticulously crafted to the woman's torso instead of legs. The statue had some writing at its base, a writing I didn't recognize. I reached out to pick the statue up and take a better look, but Mike shouted, "Stop! Don't touch it." I pulled my hand back about an inch from the statue. "We need to leave this place, quickly," Mike said as he put his hand on my shoulder. "Are we just going to leave them like this?" I said, shining my light in their eyes. "We'll plant the explosives and put them on a 90-minute timer," he said. He was already removing the explosives from a pouch on his belt. "They're unarmed," I implored, turning to Mike. "These people are dead, maybe worse than dead. I saw something like this once before, at home in the bayou." I didn't argue any longer. We planted the explosives in a rush, set the timers for 90 minutes, and ran up the stone staircase as fast as we could. It felt like a lifetime till we reached the small room with the lamp. I climbed into the tunnel, and Mike followed. Suddenly, we could hear a woman's voice faintly calling from far behind us. "Ignore it, keep moving," Mike shouted from behind me. I didn't need to be told. I wasn't going back. It was the longest crawl of my life. I saw daylight and kept crawling, even though my hands were raw and bloodied. I emerged into the light of day and gasped for fresh air. Mike followed. We warned the others about the explosives, but told them nothing else. Mike and I sat in total silence away from the tunnel entrance, waiting, praying. The ground shook. A dull thud was heard, and a spray of dirt emerged from the tunnel. We both breathed a sigh of relief. It is only after an experience like that that you ask yourself the small questions. To this day, I still ask myself, who the heck was keeping the candles lit in that damn room? So all of this happened back in 1942, during the Arakan campaign in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. The Japanese had advanced all the way into Burma, and the Allied army, including many Indians, tried to push them back. It was their first big offensive, and it didn't go well at all. We were completely unprepared. Back then, Indians couldn't be higher than a certain rank in the army, and all the top positions were held by the British. Unfortunately, they weren't familiar with fighting in the thick, humid jungles. Our supply lines were weak, and Bengal, which was our starting point, was about to face a terrible famine. The Japanese, on the other hand, were well prepared. They set up strong defenses and often ambushed us. It was common for entire groups of our soldiers to be wiped out suddenly. They'd attack out of nowhere and vanish before we could react. It was terrifying. Every little sound made us tense, ready to shoot. On top of the enemy, the environment was brutal. Diseases were a bigger threat than bullets. We barely had enough food, and there was always the risk of malaria or dysentery. Insects and snakes were a constant danger, and the heavy rains made everything worse. They ruined our communication lines and turned the ground into deep mud. Sometimes our command structure broke down so badly that parts of the army were almost acting on their own. It was in these awful conditions that we encountered a real nightmare. The Japanese used a cruel tactic of psychological warfare. They'd capture our soldiers, hurt them badly, and then use them as bait. They'd leave the wounded men tied up in clearings, hoping to lure us into a trap. All we could do was hide and listen to their painful cries until they stopped. One incident, though, was different. It seemed just like the others at first. Our commander that day was James Wavell, related to a high-ranking British officer. We were patrolling when we heard terrible screams. In the jungle, it's hard to tell where sounds are coming from, but this time we were drawn straight to it. We knew where the screams were coming from. And almost as if in a daze, we grabbed our guns tight in our hands and followed, or more likely we were led there, if that makes any sense. It didn't take us long to find the man who was screaming. He was dressed in Indian Army fatigues, or at least the trousers. His shirt was torn and hanging from his shoulders. God, this is hard. He was tied to a tree and had his hands on his stomach, trying to push down his intestines that were spilling out like thick, bloody little ropes. And his screams. It's like I can still hear them, like they're still making my ears ring. The pain in those screams, I could feel it in my bones. I began walking towards him before I even realized what I was doing. I felt a hand on my shoulder and was pulled back forcefully. I looked into the eyes of the man who pulled me back. They were wide open, alarmed, like he knew something was seriously wrong here. He shook his head slowly, warning me not to go ahead even as that man continued to scream. I gulped and nodded. We spread out into the woods, with our guns drawn, keeping each other in sight to brace ourselves for the Jap ambush. I winced as twigs snapped underneath my boots. I realized I was afraid, not of the Japanese presumably hiding in the trees somewhere close to us. No, but the wounded man in front of us. It was so bizarre. I can't explain it, but I felt it, deep in my soul. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run away, to keep running until I left this man far behind me. I took up position slightly to the man's left and began waiting for him to die, and for it, whatever it was, to end. But it didn't. The man screamed, he cried, he sobbed, he called for help, but he just didn't seem to die. Minutes turned into hours, and the sun began dipping beneath the horizon, but he kept on screaming. We stood rooted to our spots, unable to move, as if mesmerized by the strange performance. The moon climbed up into the sky, and the man's blood began gleaming under the white light that beamed down on him. But he still didn't die. My legs were aching, my neck was stiff, and I could hear someone to my right crying softly in terror. It was like we knew that it was not that man, but we who were about to die. And then it happened. The man stopped crying. Then the world was plunged into silence. And I do mean complete silence. We couldn't hear anything. No birds, no crickets, no leaves rustling in the wind. We couldn't even hear ourselves breathing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then the man got up. He easily tore off the rope holding him in place and jumped up on his feet. His intestines hung limply from his belly, which looked like someone had punched a hole through it. Fuck. Half his gut was gone. Just straight gone. I could see straight through it. No man can live through an injury like that, let alone be completely fine like he seemed to be. You see how scared I am right now? Do you see how my hands are trembling even after all these years, just by thinking about that night? So you can imagine just how terrified I was when that man glared at me. His eyes shot up to mine like he knew where I was, like he'd always known where I was. There was such malice in his eyes I almost passed out from the fear, and then he screeched. It was loud and shrill, like thousands of babies screaming into our ears. I remember quaking in my boots just looking at that hateful snarl on his face. He began running towards me, with these big, loping strides, covering half the distance within seconds. Thankfully, that sudden burst of motion had restored my senses, and I started running away from him. I dropped my gun, my backpack, and just bolted. I leapt over small rocks and overgrown roots, ducked under branches, waded through thickets, stumbled in the dark, but kept on running. My boots at one point got stuck in the soggy mud, but I pulled myself free and pumped my legs to keep running. I stole a glance over my shoulder and saw him gaining on me, intestines slapping against his thigh as he ran. He was smiling, ear to ear, like the chase was the best thing to have ever happened to him, like he wanted to take his time and truly savor the hunt. Move, must go faster, I thought. I heard screams behind me, accompanied by loud tearing and squelching sounds. He was ripping the patrol squad apart, one by one, and soon it was going to be my turn. My lungs were on fire, each breath a desperate act of survival. My legs were starting to wobble. I knew I would not last long. I couldn't outrun him, but I could hide. I found this small crevice where this giant tree had been uprooted, tucked away in a dark corner of the woods. I scrambled for the tiny hole and cloaked myself in the shadows. I wasn't even thinking about snakes or some other venomous creature waiting for me in the dark. I just wanted to get the fuck away from that thing. I pulled my knees close to my chest, felt my heart hammering against my sternum, and waited. Waited for that thing to find me and put an end to it all. I heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, felt the leaves shift and crunch underneath his bare feet. Then he began whistling. It was oddly melodious, like a bird singing an ode to the forest. I heard the fallen tree creak as he stepped on it and gilded towards me. Dark drops of blood came crashing down on the ground inches from my feet. He called for me, in my mother's voice. She had been dead for over 5 years by that point. Gently, with love, he called for me and laughed when I didn't move. I put my hands on my helmet, pulled it down in front of my eyes, and began crying as silently as I could. It was over. I knew I was going to die. But for some odd reason, he didn't kill me. Maybe it's because he wanted to leave one survivor alive to go out and talk about him and spread the terror he had inflicted on our patrol squad. I don't know. I don't even know when he left. I spent the whole night there, alone, shivering in that little hole. Even when the sun had come up and bathed the forest floor with light, I still refused to come out. Such was the extent of my fear. It wasn't until another patrol came across me that I felt safe enough to come out. They had to carry me back on a stretcher. I was delirious with fear, and every muscle in my body was exhausted. But I was alive. That was the closest I came to that thing. But that wasn't my only encounter with it. All throughout my stay there, I heard stories about it. From my own regiment and others, hell, even the Japs had supposedly run across it. This immortal thing that imitated voices, pretended to be wounded, and tore apart entire squads at a time. Or how he came to you at night when you were sleeping, whispering utter hatred into your ears before dragging you away and slicing you to pieces. Some patrol squads discovered remains of corpses in odd places, like decapitated heads on top of trees, or limbs splayed out in strange patterns near the base camp. At one point, we feared we were losing more men to that thing than to the Japanese. I'm sure they felt the same. All the horrors that I witnessed in that country, the air bombings, the disease, the burnt corpses, were all nothing compared to that night. I remember how relieved I felt when we marched into Rangoon. Even with all the guns and artillery going off around me, all I could think of was that I was glad I was out of that damned forest. Hi, my name is Ethan. This is a story about the most horrifying night I've ever experienced. It was a night that changed everything for me. It was a Friday night and my parents had gone out for dinner. I was left alone at home, which was usually fine with me. I was 17 and quite used to taking care of myself. Our house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and I often enjoyed the peace and solitude. I was in the living room, watching a movie with the lights dimmed, when I first noticed something strange. Through the large front window, I could see our front gate clearly, and there was a man standing there. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but when I looked again, he was still there. He was just standing at the gate, staring straight at the house. I paused the movie and got up to get a better look. The man was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face, but there was something even more disturbing. He looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, and from what I could see, the same facial features. It was like looking into a mirror, except the reflection was standing outside in the dark. My heart started to race. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was there a man who looked exactly like me standing at my gate? I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to call my parents, but they didn't pick up. They were probably in a noisy restaurant, unable to hear their phones. I tried to shake off the fear and went back to the living room, but I couldn't focus on the movie anymore. I kept glancing at the window, and every time I did, the man was still there, standing perfectly still, staring at the house. Finally, I mustered up the courage to confront him. I grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. I shone the light towards the gate, and there he was, illuminated in the beam. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept staring at me. I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there, silent and unmoving. Then slowly he began to walk away. But what I saw next made my blood run cold. As he turned to leave, his head remained fixed on me. It was like his neck twisted completely around so he could keep staring at me even as his body walked in the opposite direction. It was unnatural, horrifying, and defied everything I knew about the human body. I ran back inside, locked the door, and closed all the curtains. I could still feel his gaze on me, even though he was no longer there. I sat in the middle of the living room, trembling, clutching my phone. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That a doppelganger with a twisted neck was standing at my gate? Time seemed to stretch on forever. Every little noise made me jump. I kept checking the window, but I couldn't see anything through the curtains. Finally, after what felt like hours, my parents came home. I rushed to them, trying to explain what had happened, but it sounded insane even to me. They reassured me, thinking it was just my imagination running wild because I was alone. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the image of that man, of myself, with his head twisted around, staring at me with lifeless eyes. The next day, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the memory lingered. Every time I passed the gate, I felt a cold shiver. I never saw the man again, but the fear he instilled in me remained. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a hallucination? A prank? Something supernatural? All I know is that it was real enough to leave a permanent scar on my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel like I'm being watched by someone who looks exactly like me.